Brian, thank you so much for joining me on the way forward on 1230 WBOK. How are you?
I'm doing great, Eddie. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you so much. I was really pleased when your good colleague, my wife Halima, said, "Hey, Brian has this really interesting view of the needs of maritime and how many more people need to understand that industry." So, for those who may not know, what is the maritime industry and what has your role in it been?
That's a great question, and the answer, Eddie, is the maritime industry is incredibly broad, and I would say there really are three main parts to the maritime industry. You have the blue water industry, which is those ocean-going ships that you see plying up and down the Mississippi River and carrying trade internationally. That's one aspect. Another aspect is the brown water maritime industry, and those are the tugs and barge combinations that you see going up and down the river that transport goods kind of on the near shore within the United States. And then finally, you've got the offshore supply industry. And so you may know down in Port Fourchon, you've got the offshore supply vessels that service the oil platforms and are looking to service the future offshore wind platforms. And so the maritime industry really is the blue water industry that is the engine of the global shipping trade, the brown water industry, and the offshore industry. And then all of the ancillary industries that go along with that. So we're talking about shoreside terminals. We're talking about the oil and gas industry. We're talking about the broader energy industry. And so when you talk about maritime, there's really no clear delineation, and it truly is worldwide at so many different levels. I had the great pleasure of serving on active duty with the United States Coast Guard for 25 years, including a tour as the chief of the Marine Safety Practice Group with the Coast Guard's legal program. And so most of my work with the Coast Guard focused on maritime regulatory issues, with 8 years in the legal program, 10 years really, serving in Southeast Louisiana, dealing with maritime regulatory issues. And so I had the honor of serving in that capacity. So my relationship with the industry has been as a regulator and also as an academic teaching within Tulane Law School's Maritime Law Center.
So, when you talk about the U.S. and the U.S.'s position in maritime, what does that look like?
So it really depends on which aspect of the maritime industry you're talking about. When you're talking about things like protecting the global supply chain, things
Mhm.
like naval power, Coast Guard proficiency, the U.S. is tops. The U.S. has incredible ability to project its naval power around the globe. But when you talk about things like shipbuilding capacity and the skills that a workforce needs, that a nation needs in its workforce to build and maintain and sustain a strong merchant mariner fleet of commercial shipping, the United States is not as strong as many countries in the world. And in fact, I would offer that that's one of the United States' weaknesses is its lack of current shipbuilding capacity, which ultimately is going to lead to a long-term lack in a lot of the skills that are needed to support a maritime workforce.
Do you know which nation or which area of the globe the you would have the top shipbuilders?
So you have a lot of shipbuilders, not exactly which nation. However, the reason why that is the case is because the United States has a very protectionist system when it comes to the regulations governing who can build U.S. flag vessels, and so it's a
Mm.
matter of economics that has pushed a lot of the shipbuilding acumen overseas.
So I ran across articles that have called for tracking more people of color into the maritime industry. So, based on your experience, where do you see the needs of this and why? Also, um, do you see the recent anti DEI rhetoric having an impact on those types of efforts?
That's a great question, Eddie. I do see a significant need for the maritime industry to ensure that pathways exist for underrepresented populations, including the Black community, to be able to enter the maritime workforce. And I I really see two ways that the maritime industry needs to do that. The first is through opportunities for skilled folks in adjacent fields such as HR, supply chain logistics, and cybersecurity, for example, to lateral into management positions within the maritime industry. And the other thing that is needed is to ensure that folks are aware of and are taking advantage of pathways that exist for entry level positions within the field.
Mm,
For example, in the Southeast Louisiana region, we have Delgado Community College, which actually has an internationally renowned maritime and industrial training center, including
mm,
a ship simulator for training folks for positions within the maritime industry. And there's a recent initiative that has just been started within Louisiana to create the Universities of Louisiana Maritime Academy, which is a consortium of the university, a consortium of schools within the University of Louisiana system
hmm
that will group together to offer training that is needed for the regional maritime workforce. It's going to be housed primarily at Nichols, but there are going to be different campuses such as UNO that will contribute programs to this overall Louisiana Maritime Academy program, which or Universities of Louisiana Maritime program, which will focus primarily on training new mariners for the brown water industry.
So I know this is a question. Anybody who's listening to this, they probably have this question, and you got to get this part out of the way. Does it pay well?
So, as with any industry, there are jobs that are lower paying, and there are many jobs that are much higher paying. I would offer that the maritime industry can have very stable jobs, some very high paying jobs, and some that are both. To give you an example of the outlier, due to the nature of the maritime industry, a lot of those foreign flag vessels that we have going up and down the Mississippi River, they come into port and they depart port under the guidance of a Louisiana state licensed harbor pilot. And those pilots can make upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. Now, they are the extreme outlier, but there is a lot of stability and career growth that is available with the maritime industry, no matter where you are within the industry.
So, what about when speaking of career growth? I mean, so the path. What does the path end look like? I mean, is it someone if they start from the bottom, so to speak? Do they start as what, a shipbuilder or some sort of a ship hand? I mean, I am completely ignorant about this. So, where does somebody enter?
So, if you're looking to work on the vessels, you would come in as an able seaman. On the larger commercial vessels, you could come in as a deckhand on the tugs and barges,
Mm-hmm.
and you come in and you learn your trade from the ground up. Now, if you come in through that route, then there are opportunities to work your way up to serving as the pilot of a tugboat, or which is the term for the captain of a tugboat,
hmm
or to work as the master of an ocean going commercial vessel. So you can work your way up from the deck plate to serve as the captain of a vessel, or you can start in the engine room and work your way up to become the chief engineer. Now, at any point along the way, you can also branch off and move into shoreside positions. There are also opportunities for folks who may not have considered maritime positions, but have important degrees such as naval architecture or
Mm-hmm.
resources to be able to enter at the ground floor on the shore side of the industry.
And when you talk about the pathways and um one of the things that strikes me is that going into this, people may also have the question, well, what am I doing? Am I transporting goods, or what makes this? I mean, clearly it's important because there's trade and that sort of thing, but from your point of view as someone who's dealt with the industry, where do you see the most importance of the industry, the maybe the biggest sense of purpose that someone could have going into the industry?
That's a great question. So there really, I would offer there's incredible sense of purpose both for the industry as it currently stands and for the future. And so I think the big takeaway for someone who's interested in going into the maritime industry right now is they get to be a vital part of the global supply chain. Nearly 80% of goods that are shipped globally are shipped by sea. And so those ocean going ships that you see coming up and down the Mississippi River are,
Mhm.
are vital to international commerce. And so you get to play a major role in that respect. For folks who choose to go more of the brown water route, or they decide to support offshore type industries, then I think the reward, besides the non-financial rewards of being part of that, would be really serving at the forefront of, I think, major changes that are coming up in transportation overall and in the maritime industry over the next several decades, including decarbonization, the chance to work with emergent technologies. We're seeing a lot of vessel automation that is going on in the maritime sector. And so you hear a lot in the media here domestically about self-driving cars, right?
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of work going on right now with that technology in the maritime space, which involves not just the technology to create that type of vessel, but also how do you regulate the activities of that type of vessel? How does that kind of vessel interact with other vessels that are like that vessel? How do self-driving vessels interact with other vessels that are crewed, that have humans on them? And so
Mhm.
there are a lot of interesting things that are going to be coming down the pipe for the maritime industry over the next several decades. And I think folks who are getting in at the ground floor now probably will see more change over the next 30 to 40 years in the industry than the maritime industry has seen in any other 30 to 40 year period.
Oh, so if anybody, I mean, anybody who loves technology, then you probably just made their ears perk up because now they can get in on the ground floor of the technology part. So we're talking to Dr. Brian McNamara, and he is an adjunct professor of law at Tulane, and also he is an associate director and professor of practice in the John Lewis Public Administration program at Tulane in the School of Professional Advancement, and so. Um, is yeah, I'm sure somebody who loves to program stuff. I'm sure somebody, they just heard something that they absolutely love being able to program a self, create the program for that. Um, but this made me think about something. There was so much frustration during the pandemic because there was all the talk about the supply chain and all the backup. And I think the everyday person may not realize that, you said 80% is 80% is what we're looking at of the global supply chain being transported by water, right?
Right.
So that explains what happened when there were all these frustrations with the backups with supplies during the pandemic, but then also the incident in Baltimore with the Francis Scott Key Bridge. That create a huge problem for maritime, at least in that part of the country, or did it create a problem throughout the entire country?
So that's a great question. It did cause an issue, albeit temporarily, for the maritime traffic in the Chesapeake Bay. And so
Hmm.
my understanding of what they did in terms of the disruption of the supply chain is it took away the opportunity for vessels to travel directly to Baltimore and use ports and terminal facilities that were built specifically for those larger vessels. During the time before the channel was reopened, the vessels had to go down to Norfolk or find another port. And so there was some disruption to the supply chain. When you have an incident like that that's isolated, like the Francis Scott Key Bridge, that's obviously a lot different than the broader pandemic era supply chain disruption because it is only one port, where the disruption we had more during the pandemic time period was more of a global issue.
Hmm.
Um, but that issue was more isolated to the Chesapeake Bay area for the most part. Now, this, however, is a chance to talk about the regulators and the other public sector folks who work related to the maritime industry. And so, the maritime industry, the actors within that space are not just the private sector folks. You've got a whole bunch of folks who are passionate about the maritime industry and come at it from a nonprofit advocacy direction, or who work in some way to develop public policy as regulators. And so a lot of my experience dealt with the regulation side, including some work supporting marine casualty investigations. And so even though there was a disruption to the supply chain in Chesapeake Bay, what happened was a lot of folks from the United States Coast Guard, from the National Transportation Safety Board, from the Army Corps of Engineers, would all come together and work collaboratively to ensure that the shipping lane was open as soon as it could, so that maritime commerce could continue. And if you remember, they actually were able to open a smaller channel first so that the smaller commerce could get through and that the port wasn't completely blocked. And so a lot of folks on the public sector side working in concert with private companies ensure that disruptions to the supply chain, when they occur, that the effects are as minimal as possible.
And part of your expertise is maritime law, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So we're talking about yet another avenue that, there are a bunch of students in college right now thinking about their law path and they want to get into law school. And I'm willing to bet a lot of them are not sitting there going, yeah, I want to get into maritime law. I mean, is this something that when you looked at your options of law school, was that something that you immediately thought about, or did it come to you?
So I ended up pursuing a maritime law approach because I was in the United States Coast Guard at the time.
Right. Okay.
Now, what I discovered, though, Eddie, along the way is that maritime law is fascinating because it incorporates so many aspects of law. And so a lot of attorneys, they come into the field and they practice in one specific area: intellectual property, personal injury, criminal law. Well, admiralty attorneys, maritime law attorneys, their work touches on everything, but just with a maritime dimension. And so what's fascinating about maritime law is the opportunity to be able to play in so many different areas of law and so many different regulatory spaces that are so important for the economy of the United States and really the global supply chain. And that's a great, I want to take this opportunity, since you asked me about maritime law, to talk a little bit about the pipelines for underrepresented communities and the opportunity for how I see recent anti-DEI backlash potentially affecting those pipelines. At the last maritime law conference I attended, I had the honor of speaking to an audience of between 300 and 350 people. And so, I'm relatively new to social media, right? But I know you're involved in social media. And sometimes when you go to talk to a group, you take your camera, you turn around, and you take a selfie. So you can see yourself and you can see the crowd behind you, right?
Yeah.
Well, I thought about doing that, and I looked out the crowd, and I didn't. And the reason I didn't, Eddie, is because of the 300 to 350 people I could see in front of me, I could count on one hand the number of people who did not look like me.
Yeah.
Now, to be sure, there are many, many different markers of diversity, right? And I will acknowledge there was a lot of international representation in that crowd. But from my perspective, what I would offer is this. I think if you've got a group where everyone seems homogenous on one marker of diversity, every individual who's there deserves to be there, right? Mm-hmm. But it does mean that there's probably a pipeline somewhere that's blocked for other folks. And so I think there's an imperative to try and work and find out ways to unblock those pipelines or to find out what's going on systemically in the maritime law field, right? That means that is keeping folks from getting to that room where they can participate in the high level conferences and the decision making.
So do you think it is just folks not even realizing that the option is there, or is it that does the industry just not see a need to do the outreach as much? Because it seems like from the DEI pieces that I did read about maritime, kind of a light bulb went off in people's heads and they realized, oh, wait a minute, we really, really need to start going after these different groups of people to get into the industry. We really need to diversify this pipeline. So where do you see the issue being?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that historically, those who held power and privilege within the maritime industry, within the maritime law space, didn't really have any extrinsic motivation or push to be looking towards other pools of candidates, right? To be part of that community. I also think, though, it's an issue of not knowing what's out there. And so, like, as somebody from New Orleans, right? As a New Orleans community, and I lived in New Orleans for 8 years with a New Orleans address, right? We know the Mississippi River is there, right? We know that the Mississippi River is the lifeblood in many ways of Southeast Louisiana. Mm-hmm. but you walk around, and in part because of the levees, you don't see it. You know it's
Right.
there, but you don't really understand it because it's out of sight, out of mind. Even walking around the French Quarter, you've got the levees that are keeping you from visually seeing the Mississippi River, unless you take the time to walk up the levee and go look at it, or unless you work in a place where your office is high enough to see the river.
Mm-hmm.
So I offer that as an analogy because I think in many ways the maritime industry in Southeast Louisiana is a lot like the relationship of the Mississippi River to the people of New Orleans. It's there, but it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind. And so I think
Mm.
there's a lot that the industry can do to educate um, folks and the potential workforce from Southeast Louisiana about the importance of blue water shipping, brown water shipping, offshore industry to the economic livelihood of
Mm-hmm.
Southeast Louisiana.
So let's talk about the way forward. For you, what is the way forward for, let's say there is someone who's listening right now and they have a kid in college or they have a kid who may be considering military service. I mean, for anybody else, though, who may be outside of those spaces, what is the way forward for someone from the Black community who is thinking, okay, this may sound like an interesting option? Where do you suggest they start?
So I would offer really a two-prong approach. And I think the one of the great things about New Orleans is that we have so many conferences, right?
Yeah.
There are so many maritime conferences in New Orleans. And I don't think that the conferences do a good job of marketing themselves to folks that are outside their already previously established communities. And so conferences like the Workboat Conference that happens in December at the Conference Center in New Orleans, the Gulf Intracoastal Canal Association, that usually occurs in March or April of every year. There are all kinds of conferences that folks who are studying in important fields related to maritime industry, such as the HR, such as the naval engineering,
Mm-hmm.
cybersecurity, and IT. I would encourage them to look up those conferences, show up, and network. And so don't wait for an invitation to join that table. Just jump in and sit at the table and start those discussions. So that's the first part. And the second thing I would offer is look into those opportunities that do exist, such as the Delgado Community College option, such as that new forthcoming Universities of Louisiana Maritime Academy option. I think that there's a lot of good work now that's being done to begin to open up those pathways, but a lot more could be done in terms of educating the workforce and especially the Black community about
Mm.
opportunities that are available.
Now I know you're biased here when it comes to military service, so I know that your bias would be with the Coast Guard. Would and educate me here. Would the Navy be an option? Merchant Marine Academy, would those be options?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, the U.S. Naval Academy, and the U.S. Coast Guard Academy are three federal service academies that folks can attend as pipelines into the maritime industry. The United States Coast Guard Academy, if you go there, it's in New London, Connecticut, so it's a little cold during the winter. But you come out of the Coast Guard Academy with your bachelor's degree and a commission as an ensign, the most junior officer in the
Hmm.
United States Coast Guard. And from there, you can go on to a variety of jobs, including inspecting vessels that come in from offshore, inspecting U.S. domestic vessels, inspecting foreign flag vessels. It really is an incredibly dynamic career path.
Hmm.
The U.S. Naval Academy, obviously, you would end up as an officer in the U.S. Navy, but there are a lot of prior naval officers who end up going down the maritime law path um, and end up as leaders in that particular field. The U.S. Merchant Marine Academy is fascinating because it's probably the least well known of
Yeah.
all federal service academies. It's in Kings Point, New York. The benefit of attending Kings Point is that as a graduate of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, you really can go anywhere in the maritime industry. There are programs that allow you to lateral directly into the U.S. Coast Guard as an officer under a direct commission program. So you go to the Merchant Marine Academy, you graduate, you become a Coast Guard ensign, and you're on the same track as every other Coast Guard officer. There are also opportunities to go shoreside from Kings Point and go work in the transportation industry. But the primary pipeline from the Merchant Marine Academy is you graduate with your Merchant Mariner's license.
Mhm.
And so you end up, the Merchant Marine Academy, along with the other state level maritime academies, is a primary driver and feeder for the officers and crew of the U.S. flag commercial vessels and the U.S. fleet.
And
And
it's interesting. A lot of people don't realize this and don't think this, but there are a lot of folks in New Orleans who have a serious case of wanderlust, and and they want to go see what's out there. So it seems like that opportunity would be there also for somebody who just wants to see what else is happening out there, and they can sail the seven seas. I guess I don't know. I don't know if they hit all of them.
So, the benefit of the maritime industry, just like how I was mentioning how maritime law is so broad, the maritime industry is so broad. And so you can have a maritime job and be local to Southeast Louisiana. You can also have a maritime job that takes you around the world. And so you can really cater your maritime career to be local or international. And as I mentioned earlier, there's so much excitement in the maritime industry about emergent technologies. And so if you're passionate about working in a field that's interconnected around the globe, and you're interested in vessel automation, you're interested in cybersecurity, you're interested in decarbonization and alternative fuels and ways that we can improve our reliance on fossil fuels, there are likely going to be opportunities for you in the maritime industry.
Excellent. Dr. Brian McNamara, he is an associate director and professor of practice in the John Lewis Public Administration program at Tulane University School of Professional Advancement, also adjunct associate professor of law, and he specializes in maritime in Tulane School of Law. So thank you so much, man. I appreciate you really agreeing to come on and give us some information, stuff we may not ordinarily find out or know about an industry that a lot of folks could have a really good living with. It sounds like. I appreciate you.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me on. And for your listeners, they're always welcome to reach out to me directly if they have any questions. My contact information is on the Tulane University website.